The September sky was gray on the day Clara was left at the door of the Vasconcelos house. The sheltered social car stopped discreetly in front of the tall wrought iron gate, flanked by ivy-covered walls, as if trying to hide what was inside. Clara was only 7 years old. She carried a small red backpack, a faded rag doll, and a gaze that had seen more than any child should ever see. The social worker, Mrs. Marlene, held her hand firmly. She was a woman with a stern expression, but there was tenderness in her eyes when she crouched down and fixed the girl's hair. She said that this would be her new home, that this family was good, and that everything would change for the better. Clara, mute, simply nodded. Her silence was her way of protecting herself. The door opened, and on the other side, a middle-aged woman appeared. It was Francisca Vasconcelos, the matriarch. She had a pale face, her hair tied in a perfect bun, and a navy blue dress that seemed too stiff for an ordinary morning. She forced a smile upon seeing Clara and extended her arms with a staged gesture. "Hello, my dear. Welcome to our family." Marlene seemed satisfied. She explained the details of provisional guardianship, reiterated that it was a humanitarian adoption, not yet formalized, but with firm intentions of becoming permanent. Francisca confirmed with measured words and an artificial calm, as if she were reciting lines from a play. During the first month, Clara observed more than she spoke. The house was large, silent, and dark. Mr. Vasconcelos, Alberto, the patriarch, barely addressed her. He spent his days in his office or in meetings, always serious, always distant. They had 2 children, Arthur, 16, and Helena, 13. Arthur barely noticed her, while Helena, with a certain disdain, treated her as an inconvenient pet. In the beginning, there were promises of enrolling her in a new school, buying new clothes, a bed of her own. But these promises dissipated like smoke. The school never came. The bed turned into a mattress in the back of the laundry room. Clara silently learned the routine of the house, waking up early, tidying the rooms, washing clothes, setting the table. She was like a shadow, present in every room, but invisible to the family's eyes. Francisca said it was only until she learned the ways of the house, that it was important to teach responsibility, that all the children in the family had gone through phases of discipline. But Clara knew with the raw intuition of someone who had already lost everything, that this was not a phase. It was a reality that awaited her from then on. The days stretched long and cold. Clara grew up folding clothes, scrubbing the floor, listening to muffled shouts, and carrying within her a silent pain. The rag doll was set aside when it tore, and no one bothered to sew it. The red backpack became a dirty cloth bag used to store cleaning rags. And with time, even tears stopped falling. She cried inside in silence, while the house went on with formal dinners, garden parties, and distinguished guests, all of them believing Clara was just another house helper. She had no last name there, no face. She was called the girl, the orphan, or simply you. But Clara observed. She always observed. The way Alberto spoke on the phone, the files that came in and out of the office, the envelopes with gold seals, the conversations that abruptly ended when she entered a room. It was as if the entire house had secrets that could not be touched. And it was there, in that prison with expensive curtains and imported porcelain, that Clara found her refuge. Books, hidden in the house's library. She read everything she could. She read at night, under the light of a lantern, after finishing all the chores. She read hidden behind bookshelves while Francisca napped in her armchair. She read even when her eyes burned from sleep or when her fingers were cracked from cold and soap. Her passion for words became a shield. She learned about laws, about justice, about stories of people who overcame. And she promised herself, one night, when the winter felt colder than ever, that one day she would leave that place. One day, she would be more than an orphan serving the family that deceived her. One day, she would have a name, a face, a destiny of her own. She just didn't know that many years later, she would be called to judge the one who once pretended to be her father. Time passed like a straight and unchanging line in Clara's life. Her eyes, once full of curiosity, became distrustful and observant. Each new day was a repetition of the previous one. The same tasks, the same senseless orders. Francisca's face was a permanent mask of indifference, while Alberto, the patriarch, alternated between moments of coldness and fragile authority. When orders were given, he rarely looked directly at her, and Clara learned not to seek his gaze. It was as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she were a tool for a family that preferred not to recognize her humanity. Helena and Arthur, although older, treated Clara with a mix of disdain and indifference. Arthur, the eldest, often made cruel jokes about her, as if he were trying to forge a reality in which Clara was less than a person, more like a piece of furniture than a child with feelings. Helena, though less aggressive, preferred to avoid contact. Sometimes, Clara would catch her watching her with a cold curiosity, as if she were some kind of experiment. But Clara did not give in. She grew up always feeling that, for her, the future would be different. Even as the years passed, there was a flame inside her that never went out. That flame came from her books, which became her only companions, and from a deep desire for revenge, not only for humiliation, but for the way her life had been stolen from her. At 17, Clara began to understand the structure of the Vasconcelos family and the web of lies that kept her imprisoned there. In her mind, the pieces started to fit together in a disturbing way. While doing chores around the house, she often passed by the offices and archives, and on one of those occasions, she came across documents that revealed the true nature of her adoption, or rather, the absence of any formal adoption. Clara wasn't a daughter, as they had implied. She wasn't a child adopted with the rights that would entail. She was there as part of a performative act, a facade the family used to showcase their supposed generosity to the world. The truth was, Clara was a prisoner, a kind of servant disguised as a daughter, a human being they could appear generous with, without ever making a real commitment. That was the moment Clara's world began to fall apart. The pain of the discovery was nearly unbearable, but also a kind of liberation. She was not just the orphan girl. She was a victim of a great injustice. Something inside her trembled. The anger burned stronger within her, and the urge to escape and find her true freedom became nearly unbearable. But more than anything, Clara began to dream of one thing: justice. A justice that would not be carried out with empty words or broken promises, but through concrete actions. She knew she had to become someone. She couldn't go on being a ghost in the lives of the Vasconcelos family, a shadow that disappeared when they turned on the lights. At 18, Clara decided her only way out was through education. She enrolled in high school, took the entrance exam for law school, and, with great effort, got in. The journey was hard, and many times she had to split her time between house chores and her studies. The book she once kept hidden under the bed was now a law textbook, and she devoured every page with the passion of someone who knew her only chance of survival was to arm herself with knowledge. However, her victories were silent. She was just a student, a young adult with few resources and a lot of determination. But over the years, Clara became increasingly unstoppable. She got her degree. She passed the bar. She became a lawyer. She worked tirelessly, fighting against the very systems that once trapped her, against the inequalities life had thrown her way, and against the contempt she had always felt from those around her. Clara knew her mission was just beginning. But one day, years after her graduation, the unexpected happened. She was called to work on a case she could never have imagined. It was a corruption lawsuit involving the Vasconcelos family. Alberto Vasconcelos, the patriarch, was being accused of embezzling public funds. The family company, which had always appeared to be a solid and respectable business, was under investigation for illegal practices. For Clara, this was not a coincidence. It felt as if fate was finally giving her the chance to rewrite her story. She couldn't believe what was in front of her. This was the moment she had longed for, the moment to turn the tables and somehow return the pain she had carried all her life. However, Clara's internal conflict was immense. She knew that if she accepted the case and it moved forward, it could mean the destruction of everything the Vasconcelos family had built. And the family, as cruel as they had been, still represented a part of her past, the darkest and most painful part. But Clara knew it couldn't go on. She could no longer be invisible in someone else's life. She needed to seek justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been exploited or neglected by that family. And so it was that Clara, the once invisible orphan girl, became a lawyer. And so it was that she, with unimaginable strength, prepared to prosecute Alberto Vasconcelos. The courtroom was packed. Clara Vasconcelos, now in her early 30s, felt the weight of the room like never before. The heat of the spotlights, the muffled whispers between attorneys, and the presence of Alberto Vasconcelos, seated in the defendant's chair, made the atmosphere unbearable. She, however, remained firm. Her steps were calculated, her posture commanding. The orphan girl who once scrubbed the floors of that mansion was now a grown woman, a woman who, in that courtroom, embodied the justice that had long been denied to her. Alberto Vasconcelos, the man who had made her feel invisible for so many years, was now before her as a defendant. He appeared calm, impassive, as if none of it was more than a minor annoyance. He wore the same expensive suit he always used for family meetings, the same face, the same cold and calculated expression. He was the same Alberto as always, but Clara knew this would not be the same encounter. She was no longer the girl he ignored, used, and belittled. Not anymore. Today, he was the one on trial, and she was the judge. That trial was more than a mere legal formality. It was a battle for the recognition of her own humanity. She had made it this far not only because of her legal skills, but because of the pain and injustice he had made her endure. The judge signaled the beginning of the session, and Clara sat at her table, focused, eyes fixed on Alberto. For years, she had prepared for this moment. Every law book, every page read, every case solved, all had led her here. But none of it had prepared Clara for the impact of standing before someone who was once her family, before the man who had stolen her childhood and treated her like an object. The charges were clear. Alberto, along with his family, was under investigation for fraud and embezzlement of public funds in a scheme involving his company, Vasconcelos and Company. As the company's president and family patriarch, he was at the center of the operation. The evidence, gathered over months of investigation, showed clear signs of contract manipulation, money laundering, and bribery of public officials. It was a major case, far bigger than Clara had imagined when she agreed to be part of the prosecution. But for Clara, the case wasn't just about stolen money. It was about years of psychological abuse, about the false promise of a home, and about the abuse of power. Throughout her childhood, Alberto had ignored her, treated her as insignificant. But now she was here at the heart of it all, determining his fate. And he knew it. When Clara began her opening statement, her voice, usually calm and measured, was firmer than ever. She was no longer there to impress. She was there to deliver a truth that to many might seem like legal formalities, but for her, it was a matter of life or death. Her own life, the life she never had, and the cruel past imposed on her by the Vasconcelos household. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to discuss a case of large-scale corruption in which the defendant, Alberto Vasconcelos, directly participated in contract fraud and embezzlement of public funds, Clara began, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. But this case goes beyond that. It goes beyond the simple theft of public money. The defendant, who always presented himself as a man of principles and character, has another side. He is the patriarch of a family that used his position to oppress, humiliate, and deny the rights of a child who once believed he was her salvation. Clara's words cut through the courtroom like a sharp blade. Alberto Vasconcelos shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression hardening. He tried to maintain composure, but he couldn't hide the subtle fear in his eyes. It was the first time someone had looked him in the eye and challenged him that way. The orphan girl was no longer there. The woman he once despised had become the judge he now feared. Clara continued, her voice steady and unshaken. For years, I was treated like a servant in the Vasconcelos home. I was the adopted daughter who never had any rights. I was a child who cleaned the rooms and washed the dishes while they sat at the table and pretended none of it was happening. And all of this because my existence served only to give the appearance of benevolence to a family that saw itself as untouchable. She paused, looking directly at Alberto, who now appeared more tense. This is not just about financial corruption. We are talking about destroyed lives, crushed dreams. Mine was one of them. And now, I am here to make sure you pay for all of it." The room was utterly silent. Clara felt a wave of emotion rise in her, but she stayed composed. She looked at the judge, the jurors, and the defense attorneys, who seemed taken aback by the direction the prosecution was taking. The defense attorney tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a gesture. Clara prepared for the final part of her statement. She knew the closing would be decisive. There was no turning back. "I am here to demand justice," she said more softly, but with a weight that gave her voice the gravity of years of suffering. "And not just justice for this man's actions, but for my own life. Because true corruption is not only in the money he stole. True corruption is the lack of humanity, and that is what he must pay for." The silence that followed was deep. Clara was exhausted, but fulfilled. The internal battle, the sleepless nights, the hours spent studying and reliving her pain, it was all there, right in front of her. She had fulfilled her mission. The justice she had long pursued and fought for now felt within reach. The trial went on, but Clara already knew what was coming. And when the verdict was finally read, it wasn't just a conviction of Alberto Vasconcelos that brought relief. It was a feeling that, at last, he would pay for everything he had done, and that she, Clara, could finally have her name recognized, not as the orphan, not as the maid of the Vasconcelos household, but as a woman of power, as a judge who finally delivered justice. After the verdict, the courtroom felt drained of all its energy. Alberto Vasconcelos, the man who had once cast a threatening shadow over Clara's life, was now being led away by authorities. The conviction had been a resounding victory, not only for the justice system, but for Clara. She had finally gotten what she had longed for, the feeling that the pain she had endured over the years had not been in vain. As Clara left the courtroom, she was met with the gazes of her colleagues, who congratulated her on her courage and skill. But the greatest acknowledgement she felt at that moment didn't come from her peers or the attorneys. It came from within her own soul. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and shown herself that there were no limits to what she could achieve. In the days that followed, Alberto Vasconcelos' conviction became a major headline in the news, but Clara remained discreet. Public attention was never what she sought. What truly mattered to her was the impact this victory would have on her life moving forward. She was no longer a lost orphan without a voice. She was a woman of power, with a clear future and a mission that extended beyond the walls of the courtroom. Now firmly established in her career as a judge, Clara had found a new purpose. Her position gave her a platform to fight for cases like hers, where the vulnerability of individuals could be protected and justice delivered without fear or favor. The system that had once seemed like a distant, oppressive monster was now a tool she would use to correct wrongs and restore people's dignity. In her personal life, she also began to rebuild what had been lost. She surrounded herself with people who respected and admired her courage. The loneliness that had accompanied her for years, during the time she was just a servant in the Vasconcelos household, was slowly replaced by genuine bonds of affection and respect. Clara started visiting the homes of colleagues and friends who saw her as an equal, not as a shadow in someone else's life. In the months following the trial, she also made a point of rediscovering her identity beyond that of a judge. She visited the orphanage where she grew up and reconnected with others who, like her, had been left behind by a system that often gave them no chance. With them, Clara shared her story, showing that it was possible to overcome even the greatest obstacles, and that pain could be turned into strength. She became an inspiration, not only because of her legal skills, but also because of the example she set for the world, that the past does not define who you are, but what you choose to do with it. Alberto Vasconcelos, sentenced to a long prison term, found himself far removed from the wealth and status that once surrounded him. He became an isolated man whose empire of corruption had been brought down by someone he never truly believed could be a threat, the orphan girl he had treated with disdain. He realized too late that Clara had never been a victim, but a survivor, and in the end, she would always be the true victor in that story. In his solitary moments in prison, Alberto reflected on his life and the choices that had led him there. He knew that, contrary to what he had always believed, it wasn't power and wealth that made a man great, but how he treated others. Alone, he finally saw what his lack of humanity had cost him. the loss of everything he once valued, and the price he now paid through condemnation and the scorn of society that no longer respected him. Clara, on the other hand, found the peace she had always searched for. She knew that justice had been served and that true healing came not just from Alberto's judgment, but from her own transformation. She had finally broken free from the chains of the past. The man who had caused her so much pain had been punished. But for Clara, true freedom was the ability to look toward the future without the scars of her history. She now had control over her life, and each new day was a chance to rewrite her story. A story where she was a heroine. One summer afternoon, Clara decided to go to the beach, a place she had always dreamed of visiting but never had the chance to as a child. Sitting by the shore, with her feet touching the cool sand, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph over others, but a smile of self-understanding. She had won, not just against Alberto, but against her own fears, doubts, and pain. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but she now had the strength to walk it with courage. Clara Vasconcelos's life had changed forever. She was no longer the orphan girl a deceitful family had used to serve their own interests. She was a strong woman, a judge, and the past no longer defined her. She was the master of her own destiny.